Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning into another Supatease video. And in this one, we're going to be ranking all of the specializations in PvP with regards to how easy they are to play. I get questions a lot of the time. Which classes are the easiest ones? I just want something straightforward, not a ton of keybinds to jump on and start playing. So you're going to have an excellent idea by the end of this video on which specialization is going to be best suited for your desired level of difficulty. So let's just get started. There's a lot of things to take into account here when determining the difficulty of a specialization, which actually makes constructing this tier list very difficult. The first thing is tuning. Sometimes a class is just tuned remarkably high. You're just doing insane amounts of damage and healing to the point where it's not really hard because you're just overrunning everybody. Another factor is keybinds, so that's going to help determine whether or not a spec is simple or complex. If it's less keybinds, it's going to climb up into the S tier. If it's more keybinds, it's going to be pushed down lower into the D tier. And then the next one is a little bit more nuanced. It's things like crowd control, diminishing returns. What's the general concept of the class? Is it just maintaining your damage rotation? Is it finding crowd control windows? How much defense versus offense do you need to be focused to? Can you tunnel vision on one specific aspect of the game and still see success? This is the type of nuanced stuff that we're going to be talking about. So for Frost Death Knight is kind of a burst-based class still around Pillar of Frost. You've got Death Grip, Blinding Sleet setups that you need to try and aim towards. Defensively, you don't really pay too much attention to your team aside from one ability being the anti-magic zone, and this is generally an ability that you want your healer to be calling for, so it's not even kind of in your own domain of responsibilities. It should be considered allocated to your healer as a defensive to use, and due to that offset of responsibility, trying to set up multiple grips and burst people down is pretty straightforward. Just try and initiate that as much as you can, and you're going to start seeing success. Now, based on tuning, again, this class could be even more easy to play or more difficult. I'd say it's probably middle of the road in terms of overall power right now. It's not like, really like the craziest spec ever in the game. Staying alive can be very difficult on this specialization, and because of the tuning, I think that holds it back from being an S tier right now. This is in relation to Dragonflight, the first season of PvP, and that's why this is such a hard list to make. I think that has straightforward strategies. You can generally tunnel vision on offense and still succeed with the specialization, but given the tuning of itself versus other specializations, the chances of you having as much immediate success with it compared to others is going to be much lower. Fury Warrior, this is a very straightforward spec. Just run in and zug people down. You've got tremendous self-sustain and healing that's baked into your damage rotation. Most of the popular specs at the moment actually reduce the number of key bindings that you have at the moment. Based on its key binding load, it's really low. You can generally tunnel vision offense, although some defense is going to be is nice with intervene. Having fear, intimidating shout, using it on defense or offense. It's tuned remarkably high at the moment. I would say that Fury Warrior is one of the most straightforward, easy and powerful specializations that you could be picking up right now. Arms Warrior, unlike Fury, is not going to have the same type of leeway when it comes to defense, which makes it a lot more difficult to play. You're going to have to be paying a lot more attention to your positioning, but it is getting better and better with every patch in terms of its tuning and its power. But I think given its defense relatively compared to Fury, is that it's going to be a bit harder. Rotationally, we could debate for a while as to whether or not it's actually more difficult or less difficult. I'd say it's still a little bit more difficult than Fury. Fury not having damage over time effects to manage, like things like Rend, and just kind of being this build up a full rage bar and spend it makes it less complicated. So because of that, I think Arms Warrior is probably coming in the middle of the pack for me. Unholy Death Knight, you've got a lot of cooldowns to manage and stack together, unlike Frost, and you also have the pet management, and this means that you're gonna have to have extra keybinds for your pet, interrupts and stuns and that type of deal. Still kind of tunnel vision on the offense, but I would say that it is harder to play than Frost, and mostly just because you're managing an extra pet. You're gonna have likely a few more keybinds, I believe here, but in terms of defense and strategy, they're very close to each other. I think the big difference is just extra keybind bloat in terms of its difficulty. Havoc Demon Hunter, this is a very easy S tier here. This one's gonna just be rolling people over, doing a lot of damage. You want to be most of the time setting up all of your crowd control on a healer, ranged stun, ranged incap, ranged fear, trying to chain those together. The skill cap of Havoc Demon Hunter is actually very high in the sense of what you need to do to stay alive. So trying to like pre-darkness or pre-blur, there's a lot of anticipatory things you need to do, but generally to start having immediate success, this is not necessary. This is like when you're at the top of the ladder, that's when you're going to need to start incorporating this. I think that it is still very easy to just get in, do a lot of damage, self-sustain with leech, the fact that your healing is baked into your damage, your keybind load is very low. This is probably the easiest specialization, definitely the easiest melee DPS if you're looking for ease. Balanced Druid, now this is one that can be very easy if it's tuned to be very easy, right? Just maintaining dots on targets, AoEing people down, you don't really cast a lot, that's not very difficult to pull off. But if it's tuned in a way where it's not able to find kills or execute on victories, then you're going to struggle, right? So that's going to hold it back. The fact that its defense is a lot lower right now, it's going to be really tough to survive. You have to be really good at kiting, and you also have crowd control diminishing returns with cyclones. You need to be aware of keeping your team alive with cyclones and trying to get cyclones on enemy healers, and timing this type of crowd control I think does make it a lot more difficult at the moment, given the current patch. But again, if it's tuned to a position where it's just doing overwhelming amounts of damage, it's really easy to play, and balanced druids have had patches like that where you're just Starfalk and everything on the other team is dying the whole time. I think it's probably middle of the road at the moment. Easier than a significant amount of other casters, I think. But given the tuning, you're probably going to struggle on it at the moment. Feral Druid, I think that this spec is actually very hard to play at the moment. Is it the most difficult spec to play, though? Is it a D or a C is what I'm really trying to decide right now, because it has a huge amount of key bindings. You got to focus on healing allies. You need target D macros for that. You've got enemy offensive crowd control that you're going to have to gauge out, maintaining and managing bleeds, lining up your cooldowns so that they can sync well together, coordinating crowd control, assisting your team with crowd control chains. It is a very difficult spec. Defensively, I think that you're also very fortified, though, and you're going to be able to be pretty stable. So it's I want to say that it's down here. I'll put it down here, even though I'm edging more to C. But Feral is very complicated specialization, especially when we make it relative to Demon Hunter. Resto Druid, this is a specialization which, once you get the basics of it, like Iron Bark, Cenarian Ward, extend the Cenarian Ward with Swiftmen, maintain Life Bloom on your target. If you got those kind of basics down, you're going to start having a lot of success with it. But obviously, having Cyclone and multiple crowd controls, you can really see the difficulty and complexity of it start to rise, but you don't necessarily need to do those things to have immediate success. So for me, I actually do think that Resto Druid is an easier healer to play at the moment. If you just stick to those basic concepts and focus on your healing rotation and staying max distance away, you'll have success with it. But if it was necessary to crowd control as much as it used to be, it would be way harder to play. But at the moment, you can get away with a lot. Devastation Evoker, this class does not have a lot of key bindings. You just need to focus around your Dragon's Rage and your Deep Breath Burst setups and chaining those together with Tip the Scales, Fire Breaths, and getting Disintegrates off. I think that this is almost the Demon Hunter of casters. The only reason that I don't think that it is because its survivability is very low. So if you're getting trained down and swarmed by melee DPS, you're really going to struggle with that. And I think given the tuning, that's going to make it more difficult. But it's the key binding bloat, the amount of crowd control that you have, it's not super complicated. I want to say that it's here, but the tuning is making me want to put it here just because. Okay, this is like a caveat. If it's ever tuned or the defense of these classes that is making them very easy to play is lowered, then it'll probably be more equal. But I think that based on its keybind load, it's not a super difficult spec to play. It's still new, obviously. So as people adjust to it and figure it out, it's going to become easier and easier over time. Is it that easy? Verdant Embrace for healing. You got to land Landslide, Skill Shot Roots. Your Sleepwalk's pretty basic crowd control. I think that it's pretty easy to play. It's just tuning, again, it is going to be the main struggle for this. Now, Preservation Evoker, this is one, again, where tuning is going to make it a lot easier. I think it's a very complicated specialization. Which spells do you want to duplicate with your Echo? How do you want to line up all of your cooldowns together? What order do you want to use them? Its crowd control is pretty limited, which would make it easier. The fact that it's over-tuned at the moment, like one of the best healers in the game, makes me think that it's going to be the easiest healer to play. You can kind of just, fumble your cooldowns in any order you want. You're going to be making your way through a lot of matches, whereas other healers are not going to have that same type of luxury given the tuning. So given the tuning, I think we're going to say that Preservation Evoker is S tier, but that's, again, relations to this patch. Maybe we should drop Devastation Evoker if that's the case. Given the tuning on this patch, I think it's going to be easier healer to play, but rotationally, if you wanted to min-max it, I actually do think that it's very complicated. Beast Mastery Hunter, this is maybe arguably the easiest spec in the game. Kind of just hit your buttons, randomly attack things, and try and trap the healer when you can, but maybe you don't even need to. Just don't die and keep attacking. I think defensively, it's held back comparatively to these other specializations, but the rotation, the low amount of key bindings, the simplicity of strategy on it, it's got to be the easiest PvP spec. I feel like it's probably been the easiest PvP spec forever, but it's definitely still easy. Survival Hunter, definitely a lot more complicated. Got to be aware of your positioning when you're jumping in, and you're very squishy and easy to kill. I'm going to be putting it here on C tier for difficulty comparatively to Beast Mastery Hunter, just for those reasons. Marksmanship Hunter, again, you're very squishy. Same kind of deal with Devastation Evoker, but offensively, I don't think that your kit is super difficult to pull off. The defensive kiting is going to be a lot harder. You don't have the same type of healing that Devastation Evoker plays. So it's probably, I want to say it's like here or here. Some of these specs are really hard to decide. I think it's really straightforward, but you can get overwhelmed and die pretty easily on this specialization. But what you're trying to accomplish in the game is not going to be overly complicated. Arcane Mage, I think that the spec is really hard at the moment. If you're not a veteran of Arcane or understanding of the mechanics, that you are going to fail miserably on it. The fact that you've got to maintain and organize crowd control, set up burst, overall sustain it's all right. It's better than the other Mage specializations at the moment, at least for now. I think with the changes coming to Frost, it could be a lot different. But yes, Arcane is going to be a really tough spec to play. Rotationally, and you got a couple of schools of magic now, but still it's pretty punishing if you're interrupted and shut down. So I do think that Arcane is very difficult. Fire Mage, this specialization I don't think is very difficult in terms of doing damage, combustion, smash out your buttons, but tuning wise, it's really underperforming. It's getting some pretty significant buffs. And the fact that you do have crowd control, diminishing returns, how do you want to time your Frost Novas, I do think makes it more complicated overall. But again, this is a spec where tuning can determine whether or not it's difficult to play, right? In previous patches, defensively, this thing would just never die. I feel like this is a Shadowlands tier list, I'd say it's very easy, but the fact that now it's not as easy to survive and your damage is much lower, that I think it's going to be more difficult to play, and the crowd control aligns with that as well, and the keybinds align with that as well. Frost Mage, I think this is really easy to play, really straightforward. It's the only Mage specialization where you could probably win most games without sheeping. You're just going to be attacking Frost Bolts, Ice Lances, keep Blizzard down, Frozen Orb, pump out as much damage as you can. I would actually argue that this is the easiest Mage specialization to play, and debatably the easiest caster to play at the moment. So if you're thinking about a caster or a wizard. Mistweaver Monk, this is a really tough one to call now because of the fist weaving build. I think compromising your positioning, finding your moments for fist weaving is actually a layer that makes Mistweaver very difficult. And it seems to be one that is becoming more and more necessary, but I feel like you could still get away with kind of just sitting in the back, healing with Soothing Mist. So it's probably, I want to probably say like it's middle of the pack at the moment. It depends really on whether or not the fist weaving becomes a thing, having keybinds for all those attacking spells on top of the healing. So maybe it's a little bit, more complicated. I feel safer putting it in the middle of healers. I think you can generally get away with just sitting in the back and healing with Soothing Mist and win most matches. But if you wanted to push it, you could make it more complex. Honestly, if your class ends up in the middle here, it's probably like the perfect class. It's not too complex, but not too simple, and has some room to grow. So honestly, this is like, to me, this is like the optimal spot to be as a class, if we were actually thinking of it that way. Windwalker, I think this is a very difficult spec to play, but at the same time, much like Devastation, you're just setting up burst windows around your Incapacitate and your Leg Sweep the same way that Devastation sets up burst windows around his Deep Breath, and you've got to line up all those cooldowns in those windows. If you don't understand that concept, you're probably not going to succeed with it. Defensively, your defense is based around mobility, so you got to be aware of where your portal is, where you are on the map, and how you want to combine your cooldowns together, because some of them are weaker than others. I think it is going to be more difficult to play, but probably not the most difficult specialization to play, but definitely more than others. Definitely more than a significant amount of the melee DPS available. Holy Paladin, I think this one's pretty straightforward. You're building up holy power, spending it on Word of Glory, trying to stay in the back. You run in for some pretty basic crowd control chains like Hammer of Justice. I'd say that this is, probably the easiest healer to play, just play style wise. But tuning, it's kind of struggle at the moment. Paladin is kind of like, not the best performing healer. So while I think that it's easy to play, you may still struggle with it. I think just based on its ease to play that I'm putting it onto A tier, but its tuning makes me want to pull it down, that it'll be harder to win with it. So take that into account. Easier to play, but harder to win just because of tuning. But if tuning changes, which it has been ongoing, then it would be an easier spec. Prop Paladin, I think the spec is really forgiving. It has a lot of cooldowns to use, but you can kind of fumble them, keep people alive forever. Prop Paladin is ridiculously easy. Rep Paladin, I think this spec is also very easy at the moment. You've got some key bindings to worry about, though, with things like Sanctuary and Freedom on your party members. But rotationally, just building Holy Power, spending Holy Power, trying to dunk down on targets. Very straightforward concepts. I think maybe because the fact of the hybrid utility would make it a little bit more difficult than an S tier. But it's, I don't know. I think Ret is pretty easy and straightforward to start having some success on. I'm going to be putting it up onto the S tier for ease to play. A little bit more keybind bloat. Now, a lot of Ret Paladins are still succeeding. They're probably not even specking Sanctuary or even using Freedom on their allies, so it's probably easy, but has room there. Maybe it's here. Maybe it's here for ease. Discipline Priest, I think this is very hard to play now. It used to be easier to play when you had multiple schools of magic, but now if you're kicked on a heal, you're like pretty much stuck there doing nothing. You're going to have a really tough time, and the tuning for it is also making it a struggle. Maintaining yourself offensively, not falling behind, keeping your atonements going. I think that Discipline Priest is actually very hard to play at the moment. I'd be putting it down on C tier. Holy Priest, I think, is a bit easier than Disc. It's got a lot more immediate recovery, has more ways to get easy crowd control than Discipline, and the instant healing is a big difference why I think that it's easier to play. Tuning, it's probably close. I don't think it's close to Preservation Evoker, though, so maybe Holy Paladin should drop down. We'll have to assess this later. I'd say it's probably middle of the pack at the moment in terms of difficulty. The crowd control chains are easier than a lot of other healers, or comparably to things like Mistfever Monk, Chastise Fear. Sit in the back with instant heals. You want to be utilizing and abusing mind control a lot with this. That's going to be where the skill cap is for it, but it's probably middle in terms of difficulty, maybe edging closer to A tier. Shadow Priest, I think the general idea of Shadow Priest to try and end games is easy. Stun Silence the healer, Mind Game Psyfiend, that type of deal. Just repeat that as much as you have or you're able to. I think it's pretty forgiving right now, as well as in terms of personal defense and survivability. Crowd control, you've got mind controls you can peel for your team. Leap of faith to try and pull people around. You're going to have some keybind bloat because you have offensive utility and defensive utility that I think makes it more difficult to play. But tuning wise, I think it's very forgiving at the moment. So because of the tuning, I think that it is easier to play. If it was tuned to be weaker, then I would say it's probably, maybe a C tier, a little bit harder to play than a lot of other classes. But given the tuning, I think it's going to be a little easier to succeed. I think, again, because of the tuning, I'm going to pull Paladin down a little bit here. Assassination Rogue, I think this spec is actually very easy at the moment. Maintaining bleeds on one target. It's a little bit more complicated than it has been in the past. A little bit harder than it has been. Kidney shot the target, tunnel it down, blind the healer, rotate your cooldowns as much as you can. A bit fragile, so maybe it's not like an S tier in terms of difficulty, although I do think it's probably the easiest rogue spec. It's got to be the easiest rogue spec. So A tier, bordering S tier in terms of ease. Outlaw Rogue, very complicated spec in terms of rotation, how you want to min-max it. I don't think you're ever going to really fully min-max it. But again, given tuning, depending on if it's invincible and can run around and it doesn't really matter what it's doing with its complexities, to be able to win can make it really easy like it was in Shadowlands. That's why it's important to take difficulty into account. I don't think its ease of survivability as rampant as it has been in the past. I think its complexity is still there. You don't have kind of like defensive keybinds, though, which makes it a bit easier to play. So I want to say that it's probably middle ground. You can get away with not fulfilling the complexities. Maybe you're going to struggle with it a little. I think middle is it easier to play than a Boomkin and Arms Warrior? I feel like these are pretty comparable in terms of overall rotation and what you're trying to get done. I feel okay putting it here, but I would see some debate for it on C tier. Now we've got a Subtlety Rogue. I think the spec is difficult to play because it's the only spec that plays the way that Sub does. And if you've played any other class and you try and jump on Sub Rogue, you're going to have no success. You're not going to understand how to win with it. But once you understand the nuances of it, it can still be difficult identifying which target to go after, where crowd control needs to be aligned for it. You can cheese people with Secret Technique, although I believe it is getting nerfed. The fact that you've got like this RNG cheese, it's going to be more complicated. I think Subtlety Rogue is going to be more complicated. I don't know if I want to say that it's the most complicated just because of the cheese factors on how much burst damage you can really do. Maybe it is. I'm putting it here. I think it's more forgiving. You're able to just vanish away a lot of the time, run behind the pillar and never die, and constantly reset, even if you mess up some of your attempts, which makes it easier, more forgiving than being the most difficult spec in the game. Ellie Shaman, you're going to really struggle into melee DPS. Offensively, keeping Flame Shocks up, generating Maelstrom, spending Maelstrom, not really super difficult to do damage on this specialization, but being able to survive, support your teammates, awareness to your healers, Tremor Totems, a lot of key bindings is definitely going to make it harder to play. It's probably middle. I feel safe putting it in the middle. We're going to have to move myself here because there's too many rankings. Ellie Shaman's probably middle at the moment, given tuning, and we've seen now some more nerfs coming in as well to the burst damage because it does have some ridiculously high burst available. But I'd say it's reasonably difficult. The damage rotation is very easy to jump on and pick up, but surviving a lot of the stuff available in the game, especially melee DPS, is going to be pretty difficult. Enhancement Shaman, this is a tough one again because you're gonna have a lot of keybinds. You've got the hybrid healing for allies. You got casted CC. Damage rotation is not super complex. Generate Maelstrom, spend Maelstrom. Probably middle, maybe Ret Paladin level. Is it the same as a Ret? Ret doesn't have to ground, but they've got a Sank. It's probably close to Ret Paladin in terms of ease at the moment. Yeah, I feel comfortable putting it here. Resto Shaman, we've got. Resto Shaman has to constantly interrupt people, really low cooldown. Maybe that makes Enhance harder than Ret because constantly landing a Wind Shear and landing a ground, yeah, maybe it makes it a bit more complicated than Ret. I think that having Wind Shear, low cooldown interrupt, low cooldown grounding, constantly being aware of what's going on to min-max your APM, you have to cast way more than every other healer, makes it way harder. And if you're interrupted, you fall really far behind. Maybe you don't have to cast as much now with the Healing Tide or the Healing Stream and the Riptide buff, but I still think that it's pretty hard to play and succeed on. You can get run down really easily. It'll be tough to survive. Maybe it's the most complicated healer just because of that. I'm going to be putting here on C for now. Affliction Warlock, I think this class is really tough to play. Keeping dots up when you're getting trained, not getting interrupted, trying to keep pressure, and mostly just Affliction is kind of like you got to hope your teammates can stay alive long enough that you can carry the game because you really need the game to go on for some time. It's kind of late game carry type of deal, which makes it more difficult. Low cooldown interrupt, spammable CC. I think that it's the most difficult Warlock spec you can play. I'm debating whether or not I want to say it's the most difficult spec to play because also considering to succeed on. Now in 1v1 situations, it can be really easy to play. You just drain lifing and you're not dying a lot of the time. But when you're actually like in arena and there's lots of targets, I think it can be very difficult. It's somewhere between C and D. Whether or not it's the most complicated spec in the game, I don't know if I would say it's the most complicated, but you're going to struggle if your teammates aren't able to stay alive. So I think you're going to likely have a lot of struggle on this specialization. Demonology Warlock, I think this is the easiest. Is it the easiest to play? It's the easiest to succeed on at the moment, Warlock spec, but I would say Destro is easier to play. Tuning-wise, it's just incredibly tanky, really durable, does tremendous amounts of damage. Most of it's coming from your pets, as long as you know how to micromanage your pets, but will have a lot of key bindings given how much control and the pet. That makes it a little bit more difficult to play. So that's definitely going to take it down from the S. While it's really easy to succeed with it, I think the amount of keybinds you have, like even myself, I haven't fully keybound every single thing on my Demonology Warlock. I think the keybinds are going to hold it back. I want to say it's probably middle in terms of difficulty. It won't be difficult to succeed once you've got a good grasp of it. Like it's one of those flavor of the month reroll specs at the moment, but overall keybind bloat, it's not one of the easiest specs to jump onto. Destro, on the other hand, I think is actually much easier than Demonology. A lot less to think about, a lot less to control. Just keep Immolate up, Conflag, find Chaos Belt. It's getting a lot of buffs. I think that it's with the buffs it's getting, it's going to make it even easier. So really, really good spec to pick up as a beginner Warlock in my mind. Prot Warrior, again, I don't think any of these tank specs are difficult to play. They're just, some of them are going to struggle more than others. I don't even want to put them on here because like I would say that like Blood DK is D tier in terms of your ability to succeed with it, but it's not hard to play. It's ridiculously easy, right? So I'm not gonna list these guys. Guardian Druid's the same. Like it's really easy to play with. Brewmaster, maybe Brewmaster's the hardest tank. If we're basing this on success with, they'd all be D tier, right? Because you're not gonna succeed with these specs. But given how hard they are to actually play, they're all S tier in terms of ease. So just take that into account. Other than that, thank you very much for watching the video. I do hope you've enjoyed it. You got some insight onto the classes, on the decision-making process for yourself as to what classes are going to be easy based on their keybinds or their general goals and objectives, and how fast you can start to expect some success with these classes, or if you just want to vibe out and chill. I hope that you were able to get that and achieve that goal. That was the mission of the video. And if you did, let me know in the comments down below. Other than that, thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you in the next video.